So the scriptures become alive for me when it talks about the sins of the father being passed down to the third and fourth generation. We used to believe that our children are affected in utero, but now we're beginning to realize that even before conception, our children are being affected. In my research, I would say it became an accepted way of life more than an addressed problem.
Okay.
And so and I was on that threshold of repeating. We struggle to pass the less than ideal stories down. We might talk about hunting. We might talk about great successes maybe, but we struggle to talk about that side of the coin where I failed as a young man or I struggled. And I found that as I began to talk about this, and we could have conversations about it, and even now still talk about who we are and who we're becoming, it becomes easier. The first thing that breaks down for dads, and I don't think it's getting any worse, it's always been a problem, is communication.
Welcome to 14 Hearts Podcast. We're here to learn together and grow together as dads, whether you're raising boys or trying to learn yourself. We thank you for joining us today, and welcome, Tanner.
Yeah, Nick, it's good to be here together for our third episode. It's been a lot of fun. Yeah. How's your day going?
Good, busier. Well, I think we discussed this during our last podcast, but I'm pretty sure we're right now. It's just everything is so busy, and it's just time of life.
Yeah, for sure. Yep, I know exactly what you mean. Started off with a pretty poor dad joke the last time. Didn't feel like I got the response that I wanted out of you. So I got two more here.
Okay.
Let's see if we can do this a little bit better. Why do cows wear bells?
I don't know, Tanner.
No idea? Because they don't have horns that work. And then the other one...
Out of 5 stars, I give that one it took me a little bit.
Okay.
It took me a little bit. I'll give you a 4 because it kind of took me a little bit. My brain wasn't working there.
Okay. Let me get the other one here. What did the triangle say to the circle?
I have no clue.
You're pointless.
Oh my God. Tanner, thank you for that. And I love very punny stuff. And so I greatly appreciate that you're really bringing this about.
Trying to live into it. Yeah, start off with a little fun.
Absolutely. Well, kind of on that note, we're kind of moving from fun to, we're going to still have fun today. Our guest here today is maybe going to be discussing something something I'm pretty passionate about, and maybe we're going to try to take this a little deep. Not that we need to drown in it for sure, but our guest today is Dave Musser, and I'm going to let him introduce himself as we get started. Welcome to Forging Hearts.
Hey, it's good to be here with you, Nick and Tanner.
Yeah.
Thanks for the invite.
Absolutely.
Appreciate that.
Thanks for joining.
Yes. My name is Dave Musser, and I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. Been that for a little over 2 decades. And I am also an overseer with the Lancaster Mennonite Conference. And so I oversee about 13 churches at this time. So I'm also married, going to be 31 years.
Oh, wow.
Congratulations.
Yes. And we have 3 sons. And
so no girl dads here.
No girls.
Apparently not. If you came to this podcast and learned about raising girls, you're in a very wrong place because no one here has a clue.
That is true. I've never raised girls. I'm looking forward to, I have a granddaughter, so that might count.
Sure.
Yes.
Sure.
Our oldest son is 27, and he lives in Boston. He is working on his PhD in theoretical physics
Wow.
at MIT. And our middle son is 24, keeps changing.
It does.
And he lives in Washington, D.C., and he works in cybersecurity and artificial intelligence.
Wow.
So
Wow.
in the fall, he will be going to law school in New York. So
Wow.
we're looking forward to that.
Oh my, we could really
Boy.
derail this conversation quickly, but we won't go there because I think that could be interesting.
And our youngest son is a welder, and he lives closest to us
Oh, cool.
here in Pennsylvania.
Oh, that's fun.
That is fascinating. The different career choices, career paths that they've taken. That's awesome.
Not even close to the same.
Yeah.
Not even.
And from yourself as well. I mean,
That's true. Yes, yes. So our youngest son, we had the privilege of parenting. He came to us when he was 7.
Okay.
And we were multiple homes he had been in before he came to us, and so he became a Musser when he was 8, and so he had the opportunity of learning to parent very differently. And we'll leave it at that for now.
Sure.
Yeah.
So,
Oh,
yes.
wow. That's awesome.
Yes.
Yeah. Dave, it's so neat to have you be a part of this podcast because as soon as Nick recommended your name, it was like, yes, absolutely. I've heard you speak a couple times at our church, and what you have to say is so impactful, and just the way that you share it is really neat. So I'm really excited to see to hear where all this goes.
I'm glad to be here, glad to be part of the dialogue, but I want to be very upfront. I'm not here with answers so much as I'm here with the ongoing struggle of what it means to be a parent, what it means to be a grandparent, and I'm still learning.
Sure.
So,
Oh, that's cool.
And I think that's something we can appreciate. We're growing ourselves, obviously. And I find it that my kids, I feel like as soon as I got one pinned down, having 2 boys, I feel like, okay, yeah, I understand you. I get you. And then just like that, he throws me a curveball and I'm like, okay. I feel like I'm starting over, but that's okay. And I'm realizing pretty quickly this is apparently a theme.
yeah.
So, yeah. So on that note, kind of get us going, I'd like to ask you one question. It's kind of a twofold question. And raising, quote unquote, a successful family, because this is very opinion oriented, obviously. But I would like to hear from you. How does culture define growing a successful family today, and how does the Bible define growing a successful family today? Especially with your 20 years of insight of marriage counseling, I'm sure you've probably seen it done both ways.
Well, I will begin with just discussing myself a little bit.
Sure.
Whether it's biblical or cultural, I think it really begins with being honest with who we are as dads. So I came into my marriage with a lot of control issues. And consequently, I would say a lot of anger issues.
Okay.
And I could trace that back, and have done so in my degree, my master degree program. I traced that back at least 4 generations.
Wow.
Excuse me. And I suspect that I could have kept going if there would have been people alive that I could have interviewed beyond that.
Wow.
And so these things I came by naturally. But some of the ways that I think healthy parenting has to begin by being honest with who we are and from where we come. So soon after marriage, my young bride saw one of these episodes, and she spoke so well into my life that before we have children, I need to get help. Being able to admit that is hard. I grew up in a plain community, And looking in the mirror is not something that we do well in the Plain community. We often look at others and we see the problems of the world, for example. And so it took a lot of time for me to become comfortable looking in the mirror and admitting that I have a problem, and began working on that problem. So I'm not sure that I'm differentiating here between biblical or cultural, but I am talking about where healthy parenting must begin. And I would encourage us as fathers to become authentic, transparent with a group of people, preferably a small group of people, where we can admit our own struggles. I find that a lot of the churches that I work in and maybe even oversee, we have a culture of Sunday morning facade.
Yeah,
I'm not sure what else to call it, where we put on our best, maybe face, and we go to church. And we're quick maybe to tell others what the scriptures say, but it's very hard to find that group of people where we can be authentic and say, this is where I'm struggling.
So a little bit of the plank and speck story.
Yes. Yes. Okay. And boy, I still struggle with the plank, looking in my own eye, looking in the mirror at the things that get triggered in me, and how am I handling that? So hopefully, and I think our sons have shared this with me, that they have appreciated seeing me change. And that's probably the highest compliment on this side of the Jordan that I'll ever receive, that they were able to see me change.
That is cool.
Yes.
That's very cool.
Yeah. That's so fascinating. So something you talked about, you were able to trace back this issue, for lack of a better term. Maybe that's not the right way of saying it. But with anger, back 4 generations. Was it unaddressed for those 4 generations?
Yeah, so this is a whole new study. If you go online and you Google epigenetics, we know all about genetics. Well, we don't know all about genetics, but we know a lot about genetics of things that have been passed down from one generation to another. But the study of epigenetics is looking at how do we pass things on to the next generation, like anxiety and fear, panic, anger. And as I understand it, and I'm not avoiding your question, Tanner, it's a great question because it's by my family of origin, but I'll get there. As I understand it, at Emory University, they did a test to see if they could pass fear from one generation to another. And they used a male mouse. And for 14 days, they introduced this male mouse to cherry blossom smells. And every time they did, they shocked his feet.
Oh, wow.
So in 14 days, he had developed quite a fear of cherry blossom smells.
Wow.
And 14 days is a maturation period for a single sperm cell. So as it begins maturing, it travels around the testes until it's ready to be ejaculated and impregnate an egg. So these sperm cells were saturated in fear of cherry blossom smells. They bred this male mouse, and as I understood the study and read it, the female gave birth to a litter of mouse pups, and they introduced the cherry blossom smells to that generation and watched them have panic attacks.
Really?
Wow.
So they never shocked that generation.
Sure.
And they kept tracking it, and it took 3 to 4 generations to work out the epigenetics of fear of cherry blossom smells.
3 to 4, so they would pass it down. And still not introduce a shock, and it would still go.
Yes.
Really?
In mice.
Yes.
And that's, I mean, you think of their brain capacity,
Yes.
right? I mean,
Yes.
that's, wow.
Yes. And so the scriptures become alive for me when it talks about the sins of the father being passed down to the third and fourth generation.
Whoa.
We used to believe that our children are affected in utero, but now we're beginning to realize that even before conception, our children are being affected by the environments in which they are raised. So you asked the question, very good question, was this addressed in my family of origin, the need for control or anger? In my research, I would say it became an accepted way of life more than an addressed problem.
Okay.
And so and I was on that threshold of repeating.
So the challenge. So as you say this, I think of the things that I have struggled with in the past and continue to struggle with, and boy, I pray that my sons won't have to struggle with that. What do I do? Right? I mean,
Well, that was my first question. I'm like, holy moly. And, you talk about Mike's brains being so small. I'm thinking, how more important than for us to get this right? What do we do?
So it's not a wake up in the morning and do something.
Sure.
It becomes a way of life. And so as I was doing this study, and the paper that I wrote took me about 3 months to interview people. And then I wrote, I believe it was a 17-page paper on looking at the man in the mirror. And just sharing stories with our children, our sons, talking about experiences. And a lot of us who grow up in the plain culture, we struggle to pass the less than ideal stories down. We might talk about hunting. We might talk about great successes maybe, but we struggle to talk about that side of the coin where I failed as a young man or I struggled. And I found that as I began to talk about this and we could have conversations about it, and even now still talk about who we are and who we're becoming, it becomes easier.
And the beauty of that would be whether it's a struggle that is very obvious or something that can be more hidden. When you can talk about it. I mean, I think of something from anger issues to impure thoughts or something like that. Things that that maybe wouldn't be quite as obvious.
Well, I even thought too. I mean, you had mentioned your wife correcting you, many years ago, shortly after getting married, and I thought to myself, well, perhaps it was obvious, but maybe not obvious to you. And so to have somebody, so you had somebody in your life, somebody very important to you, somebody who could speak to you. All of a sudden now, I mean, that kind of changes then. So we need people in our life,
Indeed,
who can speak truth, even if it's less than ideal.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. And it's very hard to do. Now, you two are young parents. You have a responsibility of talking these things, speaking these things to your sons. And for those who are parenting children to their children, hey, this is what I see in you, but I see it also in me. I too often came to the table of parenting to point out the growth areas of our children. But I found it better to come to the table of parenting to say, I remember when I also struggled.
Wow. So if I may ask, with your son that you adopted, how that's a whole different perspective, right?
Yes.
You'd be you something different would be entering, perhaps not from you
Right.
specifically.
Yes. So whenever we adopt, and if I may, just a moment, talk about Roe versus Wade being overturned. I think there's a lot of people in churches that are celebrating that. But I have said to the leaders that I'm leading, I do not think we're prepared for that. The word adoption carries trauma with it. Just the very word. It means something went wrong.
Sure.
And if we think about it, when we are adopted, I'm adopted, you're adopted, we are all adopted into the family of God.
Yeah.
We were not created in the family of God.
Wow.
And so the epigenetics for us is our sin nature.
Sure. Yeah.
We need to become born again in order to be adopted. Through the blood of Jesus Christ, our sins are made white as snow. So the crimson sin is washed over by the blood of Jesus, blotting out the crimson. Only then can we become adopted. But we are not without the imprint of our biological family. The epigenetic of the sin nature is still there. And I humbly share a very embarrassing moment when we adopted our son. Soon after, he was acting out, and I got down and in his face, and I said to him, "You are a Musser now. Start acting like one." How ununderstanding I was of the adoption process, because that is still a process.
Yeah.
Even me as a child of the King, I am still being made into his image. And that will continue. And so we had the opportunity of parenting a child that we did not understand how he would react or respond. But I suppose that if we would have known biological parents, we could have maybe seen some of those patterns.
Sure.
So,
Well, it made me even think too. You just as you were talking, my parents that raised me were my biological parents. So we use the word adoption, at least in my mind. I'll speak for myself as a very positive word, at least in my mind. Well, hey, great adoption. This is good. Adoption is always good, right? I mean, the Bible talks about it, but just as I'm hearing you say it, the process of adoption, yes, at the end result is good, being folded in, but the process itself, it comes with a bit of trauma. And just even thinking about how I think about that word is perhaps very ignorant, because you are right. As we're being adopted into God's family, into his fold, I bring along a little something that's probably not so pretty. And so, but I often don't think about that. Well, because I guess I'm a little ignorant, perhaps. Well, so interesting.
if we think about it at a deeper level, if I can go deeper for a moment,
Oh, you can.
I think that, and I love the church. The more we become a church of people who have been raised in the church, and then we have a new believer, somebody who is not raised in the church, accept Jesus and become part of the family, they are going to feel a lot like our son, who came into an established family. We had all of our routines.
Oh, this is interesting.
And he came into that. You talk about trauma for him.
Yeah.
And he had to make all of those adjustments and now build relationships with those people who had already developed relationships.
Yeah.
And so if we think about the church and how we're really going to start ministry, we have to be aware of what it's like for a new believer to become part of an established church and all the hurdles that they need to overcome.
Wow.
Yeah, it's funny you're talking. I'm thinking, okay, I guess this is just very new for me.
Mm-hmm. Probably a direction that you weren't thinking about.
This is great.
It's gold. Yeah. This is awesome.
Yeah, what you're talking about, this is why perhaps Jesus makes so many comparisons about the church being a bride, being a family, because essentially what you're describing, it is on so many levels. It's not just like a group of people randomly or some institution.
Sure.
But it's living, breathing, and as we adopt people as Jesus adopts people into this family, folds them into the bride, this is a very, real life is affecting, and real life in the church are a correlation of one another. Like you saw it unfold before your eyes in your own family.
Sure.
But now that's a revelation within a church that we need to figure out.
Sure.
Wow, that's good.
And I'm hoping to bring some of that experience to church leaders because our children went through also trauma of bringing in a child at the age of 7 and 8 and how it affected them. And I see it can happen in church. So you bring in a new family, their children are crawling over the pews because they don't know how to sit.
Yeah.
And people in the other pew say, oh, it's okay, but they don't feel okay.
Yeah.
And so how do we do that? But we're here to talk about parenting, not church. So,
what we were talking about too is, I think it's all intertwined together. I do. So I do appreciate that we actually took that bunny trail because that is really important for us to understand.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And Dave, I'll sort of roll into the next question with your experience with working with families and both in your profession and in your church life, specifically looking at fathers. Where do you feel, or do you often see where fathers fail their families? Do you see the way that Satan is attacking more now than he did is he attacking in different ways, using different tactics than before?
Oh, this is a great question. I want to go back to creation, if I may. And we see God he creates Adam, and he comes to Adam, and he speaks to Adam, and he says, this is what I want you to eat of and what I don't want you to eat of. And then he realizes that he doesn't realize, like God awakens and says, oh my goodness, he's alone. But he states there that it's not good for Adam to be alone, and so he has Adam. Adam doesn't know he's alone. He's just been created. So God has Adam name all the animals, and now he knows he's alone. I think there's a lot of theology in that, by the way. We can't work on a problem until we know what the problem is.
Sure.
And God goes about exposing our problems to us every day if we're open to it. So God used, for example, my ezer, the Hebrew word for helper that is suitable for him, to point out that I had a problem bigger than what I thought. So now he has a problem, and God creates Eve, and then we slide into chapter 3. And we are introduced to a very subtle creature, and he's having a conversation with Eve. Where was Adam when he was talking with Eve? Do we know?
I just always assumed he was standing there, but maybe not. I don't know.
Yeah.
He was. Okay. So all interpretations except for the German Bible does not place Adam there with Eve, at least as I understand it. But all English translations place Adam with Eve. She ate of the fruit and gave also unto him who was with her. So the first thing that I'm getting to your question, the first thing that breaks down for dads, and I don't think it's getting any worse, it's always been a problem, is communication.
Oh.
Wouldn't it be nice to read, as Eve was reaching for the fruit, her husband took her face in his hands and lovingly looked into her eye and said, "Eve, honey, let's talk." Wouldn't that be neat?
Yeah.
It would be very neat
But
for
we
all
don't,
of humanity.
But we don't see it. Adam goes silent. Now, it would be neat if Eve would have looked over her shoulder or looked at Adam and said, "Honey, what do you think I should do here?" That would be neat as well. But when couples are dating, when they're in the Garden of Eden, before the pressure of life, many couples can talk freely. And they have a great time, lots of laughter. Then they get married, they're introduced to a mortgage, introduced to parenting, trying to be on the same page. And the first thing that breaks down, I find as a marriage and family therapist, it's not problems with finances. It's not problems with parenting. It's not problems with lovemaking. It's communication about those problems.
Wow.
And too many times, husbands, we go silent, just like Adam. And we're no longer piercing into the problems. And it's occurred over and over too many times for me to feel comfortable even about myself. When conflict arises, I have to stay present and not allow my inferiority complex, my imposter syndrome, tend to have me withdraw.
Yeah.
Well, that is so interesting because it feels as though perhaps this is the case. The enemy has made it so easily distracting to blame so many other things. Like like you talked about, the communication about those things is so easy to say, well, it really is all about money, or it really is all about sex, or it really is all about you working too much, or, whatever it might be. I mean, that is so interesting. Essentially, the problem hasn't ever changed. It's just that we keep pointing in different directions.
Sure.
So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I believe Satan continues to throw things at us to break down communication. It's different now. I'm sitting here, beside me is my iPhone, and that thing buzzed a bit ago, and I've been very tempted to look at it, which would end this conversation briefly.
Sure.
And how many times in my marriage am I distracted by the things of the world? But when you boil it down, it's the same problem that Adam faced in the garden.
Well, Nick, this has been awesome. This podcast actually went longer than what we anticipated. Yeah. And so we are going to break here, and there's a lot more good,
that's right,
deep and interesting conversation that we had with Dave here that I'm excited to get to continue to discuss.
I remember thinking, man, the recording's getting really long. So we're going to just step aside to what you said, and we're going to break it apart maybe into more manageable chunks, because this is a lot to digest.
Yeah, it's excellent. It's awesome.
Okay, stay tuned, everybody.